In this lecture, we're going to discuss the transition from classical Greece to Hellenistic Greece. And the main distinction is that by the end of the Peloponnesian War, the Greeks had fought among themselves so much that ultimately they made themselves vulnerable to emerging powers on the horizon once again, not just the Persian Empire, but in particular this new state that was emerging in the north, Macedonia. A great king named Philip II, you can see his dates, 359 to 336 BC, was able to build sort of an early sort of ancient nation state with lots of money, and he hired lots of mercenaries. He galvanized his own native population and made a very large army using all kinds of sort of state of the art military tactics and technology that had come into being during the course of the Peloponnesian War. With this, he was able to defeat the greatest armies in Greece at this time, the Battle of Chaeronea, 338 BC, against the Corinthians and the Athenians. Now, he defeated the Greeks, but they had fortified cities, and he realized it would take forever to try to conquer these cities. So what he proposed instead was that the Greeks join him. He created a League of Corinth, tried to adjudicate their disputes among themselves through this assembly, sort of United Nations of ancient Greece. But he proposed that all their available military men join him in a great crusade against the Persian Empire, to punish the Persians for all the abuse they had caused Greece through the centuries. Um, a lot of Greek states were interested in this because it meant that all these sort of mercenary types would go with him, and the likelihood of him coming back was nil. So that would once he was gone, they could go on to business as usual. Everything was set, and then at the wedding of his daughter, just prior to his departure, he was assassinated in a palace coup. He was succeeded by a 20-year-old son, Alexander II. Nobody really expected him to become what he became. It's rare that you have a military leader, genius of the stature of Philip, to be succeeded by, at least militarily, an even greater genius. Alexander was a tactical and strategic genius, and he took control of his father's army. And as you know, he defeated the Persians repeatedly on the battlefield, marching all the way across Anatolia, all the way to Egypt, then all the way into Mesopotamia, then all the way into Iran. And then, out of fear that other members of the Persian royal family, these governors out in the east, might come and try to rebel, he pursued them all the way to the borders of China and then all the way to the Indus River as well. So what he did was he basically brought into the orbit of what we would call Greek culture all the earlier civilizations of the Near East and Central Asia, making it into one big sort of, not a cohesive unit, but certainly a unit now that was connected by a road system that he helped perfect, and by traders going back and forth because he was spending gobs of Persian money to make this campaign possible. Now, he died very young in 323 BC, and on his deathbed, he said to his successors, who will succeed me? Whichever of you is the fittest. And that led to the wars of succession in which his generals, the 12 marshals of Alexander, fought among themselves to claim control of this great empire that Alexander conquered. After about 25 years, it became really clear that this was impossible. And so the next generation, shall we say, of successors began to divide up the empire into component parts. And we end up with these kingdoms. We call them Hellenistic kingdoms, all of them ruled, for the most part, by a Macedonian dynasty, a dynasty of somebody in the military command staff of Alexander the Great. So we have Antigonid Macedonia, which survived from, as you can see, 279 to 167 BC. Its capital was at Pella. This was the ancestral homeland of the Macedonians, a very militarily capable and compact and defensible place. We have Adalid Kingdom of Pergamum. This was founded by actually a secretary to one of Alexander's officers, Lysimachus, Philotyrus, and but his brother's family. He had no children. He was a eunuch, but his brother had four sons, and they worked together to build this the one non-Macedonian kingdom at Pergamum, which is on the Ionian coast, on the Aegean coast of Anatolia. It survived from 270, you can see, to 133 BC. Then there was Seleucus, one of Alexander's bodyguards. He was able to carve out an empire in Syria. Its capital was at Antioch. and again, 305 to 66 BC. And then really the first of the kingdoms was Ptolemy of Egypt. Ptolemy, another bodyguard of Alexander, went all the way to India and back with him, was able to carve out a territory that included all of Egypt and North Africa to Cyrene, as well as Cyprus and many of the islands and a lot of territories on the South Anatolian coast. So it became divided up into kingdoms, right? In which city states were inside kingdoms. And so, in a way, now these kingdoms were able to marshal far more resources, larger armies, more expensive technology than city states. And city states became secondary in the most part in that. The only way, if you were a free Greek city, to protect yourself from these great empires was to form leagues. And so we see the emergence of the Achaean League based in Corinth and the Aetolian League in central Greece. Some states were powerful enough. Athens, the great city, was able to kind of survive. Rhodes, the island of Rhodes, became a great trading center, did a lot of the business for the polities this way. But what we have is sort of a brain drain, if you will, in which now it was possible. If you were a big shot in a small town in Greece, you could seek service with the courts of these various Hellenistic kingdoms and become a major player in the Eastern Mediterranean world. And they even had a name for it, cosmopolitai, citizens of the world. So what we see is that even though the city-state was still the foundation, the basis for Greek culture, now it was being exported overseas and used as sort of a breeding ground, a training ground through which native elites could become educated in Greek and Greek culture through the gymnastic educational system, and then rise up and hold important positions and run the world. Okay, so this map demonstrates the nature of the kingdoms, although their boundaries varied from decade to decade, so it really is kind of complicated in that way. We kind of say the Hellenistic world marked the demise of the Greek polis. As I said, it remained the fundamental building block of these new empires, but it was more or less subservient or intimidated by these kings. If it wasn't actually under them and paying tribute and even being garrisoned by them, then it was an independent allied state that offered friendship and military support when summoned, but had to be careful, had to be careful. And this would include Athens and Corinth, although Sparta became still kind of hostile and dangerous, but it became kind of a marginalized place during the Hellenistic era. It really couldn't maintain its empire. It lost all its subject states and so became a smaller place in that. Um, Beyond that, we need to stress, so we're looking at the monuments of the Hellenistic period. The first thing that jumps out at us are the massive fortification systems that survived throughout the Hellenistic world. One thing that Philip and Alexander did was they introduced what we call technological or technocentric warfare. The development of siege weaponry, such as catapults and ballista, you can see one, these rock firing machines, torsion controlled, that could fire about 200 yards and just repeatedly fire on a located spot, a weak spot on the walls, and bash down defenses. It became essential that your fortification systems were big enough to defend your city. To the left of the machine, you're looking at a siege tower, supposedly built by Demetrius, the city besieger, one of the great successor kings to Alexander. It was supposedly 10 stories tall, had all these windows that they could fire weapons from. And could fire down on the walls and could actually roll. It supposedly required 4,000 men to move it into place. And so warfare developed in this way. These machines were very expensive. It took a lot of money to build them, but no city, if it wanted to be free, could afford to have defenses that would avoid these weapons. We're restricting ourselves to the area of our trip. The best example I can give you is the city of Messenia. Messini, we're looking up in the upper left. There is the Valley of Messenia. We mentioned it before. It was liberated from the Spartans by kind of a Greek crusade during the 370s BC, and they took over Mount Ithome and they fortified it. And so, with Greek help, they were able to build this massive fortification system, which starts down the base of the mountain all the way to the top and around. You're looking at the wall system in the middle, right there with its towers. And then lower left, you're looking at the megalopolitan, so-called megalopolitan gate. You can see the remains of the towers on the right. That's the entrance to the thing. And then this giant round area in the interior. And so what we have is a fortification system that was designed to fire weapons at opposing adversaries. So defenses went from sort of passive defenses to aggressive defenses, where you can have sortie gates, you have machines firing at the enemy, and in particular, and Mazzini really points this out, you build a system of defenses that takes over the high ground, and so that the enemy cannot move offensive weaponry into vicinity so it can actually impact the built environment of the city. We call these Galanmauer systems, these defenses that stretched way out into the countryside, even kilometers into the countryside, in order to prevent offensive adversaries from setting up their own weapons on the heights and firing on the cities. Some other examples we can give you: Corinth. Corinth was taken over by Demetrius, the city besieger Poliorcetes, maybe around 302 BC, and he held the Acrocorinth, and the Acrocorinth became one of the three shackles of the Greek world. Whoever controlled this controlled all traffic north-south in the Greek world. Corinth had a long wall system similar to Athens that connected the Acrocorinth all the way to the harbor at Lycaon, protecting the city, and this was shortly prior to the Hellenistic uh, combat, but there's no doubt that, and this is what the archaeologists, the American archaeologists at Corinth have decided, there's no doubt that Demetrius had a major role in the construction of these fortifications. And we have lower left, you have the view of the massive towers. The one on the right, you can see the ashlar blocks. The one on the left is later. This is Venetian. You can see brick and mortar. But the one on the right, you still see the face of the ashlar blocks of one of the towers probably built by Demetrius. But Hellenistic influence in Greece wasn't just about warfare. They also did their best to sort of, when possible, be friendly with the Greeks because they needed them. They needed the schools. They needed the militias that would come and become mercenaries in their armies. They needed the support in this way. At Corinth in particular, Corinth became the head of the Achaean League and still remained a very large city in this period. We believe that the South Stoa, and I should point out this is excavated by the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, it's been ongoing since the 1920s. Here we see the South Stoa. Stoa is a large porch. This one had a colonnade down the middle and a colonnade in front, so it's kind of a double stoa. We believe this is called. We believe that this was constructed by Philip II for his League of Corinth, and that it would have faced the big athletic center, the Gymnasium of Corinth. Maybe the running track was right out in front, for example. And so that's kind of typical for two reasons. One of which was that cities proper didn't like foreigners coming in and like adjudicating law or running committee meetings in their city centers. This was, they weren't citizens. So what we see is that it was more convenient for Hellenistic kings and rulers to sort of administrate from outside the city in these sports grounds. And one theory is that these sports grounds became sort of centers of international meetings in this way. Other examples: Olympia. Okay, at Olympia, you can see in the reconstruction, if you focus on the main temple of Zeus, off to the left of that, the Temple of Hera, there's a little round temple right there, a peristyle temple. This was a monument dedicated by Alexander the Great to his father, Philip II. Two things at work here. The first one was the growing tendency of Hellenistic kings to sort of assume a divine essence to them. Many people believe that Alexander died and ascended to heaven as a hero, and so we get this sort of ruler cult of the various Hellenistic polities. They were sort of god kings in many ways. Uh, but secondly, here we are at Olympia, the greatest, perhaps, international meeting place of the Greek world, and Alexander felt it was essential to memorialize his father here. Why? Because this was a way for these newly arrived Hellenistic kings to demonstrate their arrival on the scene. It was a form of propaganda, but also an advertisement in this way. And so we see Hellenistic kings engaging in euergetism, philanthropy, to Greek city-states as a way to advertise their importance. Sanctuaries. Sanctuaries were international places where people came, especially these healing cults became very popular in the Hellenistic period. People coming from all over the world to plunge in warm springs or whatever might have been the origin to attraction to make these sanctuaries of the healing god Asclepius. And we have the main one here at Epidaurus. Now it dates back to the classical period. The stadium there dates to about 400 BC, and so does the theater. But there's no doubt that its high point was in the Hellenistic era when droves of people came to seek the benefits of the healing cult. Here's a view of the theater, and down lower left you have one of the various hotel facilities where people would check in. In Athens, similar donations were made by Hellenistic kings. Although Athens was no longer a great military power, it remained the great university capital, with the universities founded by Plato at the Academy, Aristotle at the Lyceum, and many other places, institutions. It was a place where young aristocrats throughout the world sent their young to get their finishing, their last years of university training, if we might say. And so again, another important place for Hellenistic kings to sort of advertise their importance. So here we see the great colonnade stoa of Eumenes II, which was ultimately connecting the theater of Dionysus. This is on the south slope of the Acropolis, with the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. More famous is the great Stoa of Attalus, also of Pergamum, Attalus II, the successor to Eumenes. He made the great Stoa in the Athenian Agora. About 70% of the remains of this were found on site, and so with Guggenheim and Rockefeller money, the Americans at the American School excavating the Agora were able to reconstruct this building, and they used it as not only their depot, an archive of finds, but also on the second floor, there's a wonderful museum that you can see about the Agora. Before we close, a little bit about Hellenistic sculpture and art. We like to say in the Hellenistic era, artists sort of lowered their horizons and began to focus on glimpses of sort of everyday world, everyday people showing sort of they really perfected the portrayal of anatomy. They love to show these rippling muscles, but they also have a lot of pathos. They're not afraid to show pain and suffering and the sort of nobility that comes from that kind of suffering. Let's upper right, you have the boxer, little statuette of the boxer. He's an older man. Maybe he's looking up. His nose is busted, ear cauliflower. Maybe he's being told by the judge. Next to him, we have the drunken older woman. She's believed to be sort of these older prostitutes that guard the house of the younger prostitutes. They always can be bought off with a wall, and there she is drinking right there. Next to her, we have the Gallic warrior. It's kind of a typical scene about the noble savages. He's just murdered his wife, and now he's about to kill himself rather than surrender to Hellenistic armies that are coming on in that way. Um, Next to that, we have the great piece. This is from Pergamum, the great priest of Apollo, who's being taken by the snakes, Python brought by Apollo. And you've got in the round him and his two sons all being dragged to their death. Below that, we have a slave boy on probably a slave boy, a jockey on a bronze horse. This is in the National Museum in Athens. And to the right of that, also in the National Museum, we have a funeral portrayal of a young Athenian noble, and it shows on one panel his favorite hunting dogs. The central panel has him being mourned over by his family, and the other panel has his steed, his horse, and it's being held by a African servant of his. And just the very notion that they would portray slaves and prostitutes and boxers, jockeys. This is novel. This is novel. This is the new era of the Hellenistic period and what Hellenistic